everyone. This is my very long title. So I'm going to start with this very simple statement, right? Some metaphors are easier to process than others. If you take, say, a metaphor like my cat is a princess, you might be able to understand it very quickly and have no trouble. Whereas if I say something like my marriage is a filing cabinet, it might take you a little bit longer to figure out what it means if you make any sense of it at all. So just to get some definitions out of the way, my cat and my marriage is what you in the literature would call the metaphoric topic, and princess and filing cabinet, what is referred to as the vehicle. So there's been some theories, specifically two very influential theories that try to account for how a metaphor goes from being easy to being hard. On the one hand, we have the career metaphor hypothesis that claims that it's a metaphor's conventionality that mediates between processing effort, whereas the quality metaphor hypothesis claims that it's actually a metaphor's aptness that mediates it, with conventionality being the frequency of association between a vehicle and its figurative meaning. Familiarity, which is kind of a related concept to conventionality, which would be basically the same, but not on a word level, but more on a sentence level. And aptness being the degree, either the degree to which the figurative meaning of a vehicle describes relevant features of the topic, or more broadly, how well a metaphor expresses its non-literal meaning. So we have basically these two accounts. On the one hand, either conventionality or familiarity having a negative effect on processing. So as a metaphor goes from being processed from easy to hard, conventionality and familiarity would decrease. And on the other hand, we would have aptness, also with a negative effect. Now, at this point, you might ask yourself, like, well, why should I care about this? You know, maybe all three of the factors have an effect on processing effort. Why should we kind of like try to decide between them? So the reason why it's important to look at whether one of these factors is better at explaining processing effort is because it has theoretical consequences. So this has to do with the default mechanism that the theories assume is at the core of metaphor comprehension. So the career metaphor hypothesis is based around the idea that analogical reasoning is the core of understanding metaphors. So this is a process through which during comprehension, you first align the structures of topic and vehicle to compute the relations in their structure. And after alignment, you project inferences from vehicle to topic. And only when you are exposed to a metaphor multiple times can you switch from this effortful process of analogical reasoning to a less effortful one of category inclusion, which is a special case of conceptual combination. So this would make conventionality what mediates between processing modes and consequentially between processing ease. So the quality metaphor hypothesis, on the other hand, sees that category inclusion is at the core of metaphor comprehension. So this is a process through which the meaning of the vehicle is modulated on the basis of dimensions provided by the topic in order to create an ad hoc category of which the topic is then seen as a member. So only when this process should fail would we resort to a more effortful one of analogical reasoning. Now, the idea is that this process fails when it's not possible, given the dimensions of the topic, to construct this ad hoc category. This results in basically being aptness being the moderating factor. So when a metaphor is not apt enough in order to create this ad hoc category, you would resort to analogical reasoning. So the idea that these effects are kind of rivals has to do with the type of cognitive mechanism that they assume is responsible for metaphor processing. So trying to figure out which of these can better account for processing ease will also help us understand what the underlying cognitive mechanism is, at least according to these theories. All right. So even though there's been quite a lot of work on this topic, we're still kind of at an impasse because there's evidence for both kind of sides of the debate. So we believe that some of the obstacles standing in the way of resolving this are the following. On the one hand, most, if not all, of the evidence in this debate comes from English nominal metaphors exclusively. So metaphors like my lawyer is a shark or my cat is a princess. So we would ideally want to move away from this to see how the phenomenon behaves in different aspects. Another important point is that both of these theories are somewhat underspecified regarding timing. What this means is that they don't have any specific auxiliary hypotheses regarding when exactly effects of aptness and conventionality and familiarity should arise. So it doesn't make it easy to test these theories based on timing. So we would want to create linking hypotheses for these theories based on timing to make them more testable. And finally, and more importantly, all three of these factors, conventionality, familiarity, and aptness, are highly correlated. So this also makes it hard to figure out which of the three has the kind of most important effect. So our modest suggestion to try to surpass these impasses is to, one, collect ratings of the three mediating factors, so aptness, conventionality, and familiarity, for a different set of metaphors, German verbal metaphors, and see how these ratings can account for processing using eye tracking during reading, which is a more temporally sensitive method. This will allow us to figure out, to try to pinpoint, okay, at what point do we find these effects, if we find them at all, and then try to specify the theories further. And finally, we would want to address the problem of correlation by focusing on reducing the side effects, the negative side effects of multicollinearity in the statistical model. So not focusing on the correlation per se. Now let's unpack this last point a little bit. So multicollinearity is this kind of like bad thing that can happen sometimes when predictors in multiple linear regression are correlated. So what I mean with bad thing is that you sometimes get very counterintuitive and uninterpretable coefficient estimates. So you will find a coefficient that goes from being positive to being negative, or from being non-significant to being significant, and so on. So this has been like kind of evidence as somewhat problematic that people have tried to address in different ways. For example, Jones and Estes, in the case of metaphor processing, what they try to do is figure out, construct a set of items that will be completely orthogonal for the values of aptness and conventionality, getting rid of the correlation. So what we suggest as a possible alternative for doing this is to just embrace the fact that there's correlation, because it's a fact of nature that variables are correlated. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So what we would want to do then is to try to figure out ways in which we can just minimize these nasty side effects of multicollinearity, but while embracing the correlations. And we did this inspired by a suggestion made by York 2012, as well as by Tomaszek 2018, which is that multicollinearity is not really a problem of your statistical model, but it's a problem of your informational state. It just means that you don't have enough variable unique information that can allow you to tease apart the variance that the variables are explaining, the ones that are correlated. So it's not about the correlation per se. So how do we, so then the goal would be not to avoid them being correlated, but to increase the amount of variable unique information. And these are kind of the suggestions that York made. So to try to do this, what we did was measure and model aptness, conventionality, and familiarity as continuous variables. So we measure them as continuous, and then we use them in the model as continuous, instead of measuring them as ordinal, then transforming them to continuous, and then dichotomizing them for modeling, which is what's been traditionally done in the literature. So this is something that we did to try to maximize information. We also increased the number of observations for in the eye tracking study relative to previous studies on aptness, conventionality, and familiarity. And we added several orthogonal predictors to the model to try to tease apart what variance can be explained in the model by other predictors, also following York. Ultimately, our goal would then be not to try to get the variables to not be correlated, but to reduce the amount of variance inflation. So reduce the variance inflation factor using this kind of more conservative measure of 5, as opposed to 10, which has also been suggested in the literature. If you don't know what this is, just kind of very broadly construed, the variance inflation factor measures the increase in the variance of one predictor when you're using this monster model with all the predictors, compared to when you have the same predictor in a model with uncorrelated variables. So how much of the variance is being inflated by the collinearity. All right, so the metaphors that we use were taken from the study that we previously published this year. So these were 36 verbal metaphors in German, where you see that the vehicle, in this case, is no longer a noun, but a verb. In this case, fenced in, this example, and the topic is a noun, opinion. So what we first did was then, for these 36 metaphors, we collected ratings using the IBEX farm coupled with the pen controller IBEX. So just as a side note, getting a PhD during the world pandemic was absolutely horrible, but without the IBEX farm, it would have been completely impossible. So I really owe a lot of my education to Alex Drummond, and I'm really thankful if he ever hears this for all of his work. Okay, back to metaphors. So we collected ratings using a continuous slider scale from 1 to 100. So participants actually could move the slider scale. So as this is how we kind of got the continuous measure. For measuring conventionality, we followed Jones and Estes' two-step approach. So first, one group of participants paraphrases the metaphor freely. Then we compute the most often paraphrase and get a second group of participants to rate how often they think that they've seen this paraphrase in the meaning of that metaphor. All right, so once we had our ratings for familiarity, aptness, and conventionality, we took them and we inputted them as predictors for the model of existing data, again, from the same study that we published earlier this year. So this was an eye tracking during reading study that had 64 participants in these 36 verbal metaphors. It had a 2x2 design. So the details of the original design are not really that relevant for us right now. The important thing to note is that in all of the conditions, participants read the exact same metaphor. So the manipulation of the study actually concerned a post-comprehension question and a priming condition before the metaphor. So you actually had all the information of the metaphor and all the conditions. Okay, and then we decided to focus on 4 dependent measures. So we looked at 3 dependent measures of the verb region to figure out if we could tease apart like whether the effects, if any, of aptness, conventionality, familiarity were early or late. And the verb is actually the first possible point where you could figure out whether these effects appear. And we also looked at the coarse measure of total sentence reading times, because this is the only measure that's actually been kind of reported in the literature. So we wanted to be able to compare it with previous literature. Okay, so in case you don't know that much about eye tracking during reading, these are the dependent measures that we used. So when participants read, right, when we're measuring their eye movements, they kind of go like this, and then they have these regressions back. So they go from left to right and then back to left. Then they go back and move on and go back and forth like that until they read the whole sentence. So we first measured first pass reading times, which is the sum of fixation durations in the region during the first pass. Regression path duration, which includes, it's the sum of all fixations from entering the region until moving to the right of the region. So it includes regressions to the left. And then total reading times, which include all regressions in that specific region. So because we didn't have specific predictions based on whether it should be first pass or regression path, we only corrected our p-values for the analysis following from the Mausburg and Angele. And we fitted 2 types of models. So on the one hand, we have this monster model that includes all correlated predictors, so aptness, conventionality, familiarity, plus a bunch of orthogonal variables, so verb frequency and the original factors of the 2x2 experiment. And then we fitted individual models with aptness, conventionality, and familiarity, and measure their R² to compare the model fit of the individual models to one another. So for this experiment, the predictions were kind of straightforwardly derived from the theory. On the one hand, we have the career of metaphor hypothesis that if it holds, you should find a negative effect of conventionality or of familiarity, because the two are very related concepts. And there should alternatively be no effect of aptness once conventionality and familiarity are controlled for. Or if there is, the model with aptness as the only predictor should have a lower R², so it should have a lower effect, a smaller effect. On the other hand, the quality of metaphor hypothesis would make the opposite prediction, right? There should be a negative effect of aptness and no other effects, or smaller explained variance from the other effects. So again, just to make sure that you understand this, we should expect in both cases a negative effect, conventionality and familiarity, or of aptness as mediating metaphors going from fast or slow. Okay, so let's just jump into the results. Let me guide you through this graph. So on the panel on the left, we have the total reading times for the verb region, and on the right we have this average sentence reading times. So I'm not showing you first pass or regression path duration because these are the only ones where we found any effects of the mediating factors. On the y-axis, we have a transformed measure of reading times. We transformed this based on the results of a Box-Cox test because the residuals of the models were not normally distributed. And on the x-axis, you find the aptness, familiarity, and conventionality values. Now, these little diamonds that you see there are the average reading times for each of the items, so each of the metaphors. So you see neatly all 36 metaphors. And the lines represent regression lines of the individual models that were fitted with the individual predictors, plus their confidence intervals. Okay, so the 2 models above have a red regression line because these were both the models that explained the most variance. So they had the highest R² value. And in the monster model, these were only aptness showed a significant effect, or both verb region and sentence reading times. So here we have the total reading times of the verb region. So we find that not only does it have the highest R-squared value when used individually, when fitted just to aptness, but also the monster model showed that the variance inflation factor was below 4 for each one of the predictors. So this suggests that multicollinearity was not too much of a problem because it's below our threshold of 5. For sentence reading times, we see a similar picture. Again, highest R-squared value of the models and low enough variance inflation factor so that we could assume that we're on the safe side of multicollinearity. All right, so tentatively, we would want to say that our results, our preliminary results, support the quality of metaphor hypothesis and are not really in line with the career metaphor hypothesis. Of course, there are several open questions. One very prominent one being, well, what does this tell us about nominal metaphors? Of course, like our results focus on verb metaphors, so we don't know if they generalize to other types of metaphors. But there is some evidence showing that, at least in terms of brain topography, there doesn't seem to be a difference between understanding a verbal metaphor and a nominal metaphor. And by Occam's razor, we would like to say that because this is a pragmatic mechanism, it should generalize across grammatical categories. We should expect it to be the same mechanism. So I don't see why there should be a different mechanism for nouns than for verbs. But this is an open question. And another really interesting point that has been noted in the literature is that how much can we rely on subjective ratings to measure abstract dimensions, such as aptness, conventionality, and familiarity? Of course, we can't answer this right now, and it would be ideal to look for other ways of quantifying these abstract measures. And yet, I don't see personally why, if the subjective measures are affected, why it should affect aptness particularly as opposed to conventionality and familiarity. Most importantly, though, is so for those of you just tuning in right now, this is kind of what I've been talking about this whole time. So on the one hand, I hope that I showed that you take away that measuring aptness, familiarity, and conventionality is important because it has, and trying to figure out which of these three is better has theoretical consequences. To figure this out, we measured it. We collected new ratings and used them as predictors of eye tracking data for German verbal metaphors. It seems like aptness might be the best predictor, and it's in line with the quality of metaphor hypothesis and against the career metaphor hypothesis. But also very interestingly, the effects are very localized to the metaphor vehicle. So in that sense, they appear relatively early. So this helps us refine the theory, but we only see it in total reading times. So not in first pass reading times, but regression path duration, which suggests that even though it's localized, it happens as soon as the metaphor is being understood. It might happen only in the latest moments of metaphor comprehension. So we hope to use this in future research to further specify the quality metaphor hypothesis and test these further predictions. All right, so that's it for me. Thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions.